Welcome everyone to this public meeting on the Story County Operations Climate Action Plan. Your microphones are currently muted. To ask questions, you can put questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand, and then once Chris calls on you, you can come off of mute. You can ask questions throughout the session. And I will also be placing a few links in, or at least one link in chat as we proceed. This session is being recorded. In order to speak or come off mute, you will have to accept to being recorded because of this session. If you do not want to be recorded, please put your question into chat. I'll turn it over to Chris to get started.
Right, thank you, Amy. So my name is Chris Anderson. I'm with EA Engineering, and we are working with the Story County government to produce the Story County Operations Climate Action Plan. This presentation is for public input. The Story County government wants your perspective on actions that can be taken to improve the resilience of the county government operations to changes in weather conditions, as well as to reduce the greenhouse gases that are emitted by the county operations. We have Leon Harder on from Planning and Development, and she will give an introduction from the Story County perspective and provide the motivation behind having the plan developed. And then I will go into what the presentation will cover, as well as the survey that we are looking for the public to take and provide us feedback. So I'll turn it over to Leanne for a few minutes here.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Well, thank you to everyone that's joining us and spending some nice quality time with us, on what's a very beautiful Wednesday outside. And those of you that go in and watch this recording afterwards, thank you for taking the time to do that as well. As Chris said, I'm going to just give you some background on why we're here this evening and kind of where we're going forward. Back a few years ago in 2022, the Story County Board of Supervisors adopted a resolution establishing what's called the Story County Climate Resilience Leadership Strategy. With that, they reactivated the Go Green team. That Go Green team started initially in 2008 by the Board of Supervisors, but took a hiatus when COVID hit. But we started back up in 2022. We spent time revisiting original goals from 2008 and building some more of our own, but also working with UNI's Center for Energy and Environmental Education to complete a greenhouse gas emission inventory for county government operations for the years 2010 and then 2020. That does set our baseline that we decided in 2024 to go to the board and get direction to release a request for proposals to bring someone on board to guide us in this effort to develop a climate action plan that specifically looks at Story County's governmental operations. So what we can effectuate through our daily operations as an entity in Story County. Working with the Go Green team and the Board of Supervisors, we hope to develop a plan that incorporates goals, identifies strategies and priorities, and then defines a process that will help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our county-owned sites, facilities, and of course our operations. As I said a couple times, this climate action plan is intended to focus exclusively on the emissions from our county government operations. It does not include the broader community, private sector, or households, but we do hope it will set a model for others going forward. We have asked consultants through the RFP process and ultimately selection of EA to prepare an outreach and engagement process to get input from property owners throughout Story County for meaningful property owners and citizens throughout Story County to solicit input and achieve meaningful engagement. That's really what we will use to inform the Board of Supervisors throughout this planning process. And that gets to where we are tonight. Chris will be here to provide the PowerPoint presentation, and if you do have any questions as to what Story County has been doing or why we're here, put in the chat and we can answer those as well. So back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Leanne. And so what we will talk about tonight is entirely intended to make sure that the people who look at this presentation know what is being asked for public input. We addressed the first point on the agenda is what is the Story County Operations Climate Action Plan. What I'm going to go through the rest of tonight is what is the information that we want from the public, and particularly about the weather events and disruptions caused by weather that the Story County Climate Action Plan will plan for. It will have two components. One, to deal with the impacts on the operations themselves, and to make sure then that the operations remain functional and remain cost effective as weather impacts continue to change over time. The other component will be the greenhouse gas emissions of the county government operations. This is an outgrowth from the Go Green team described earlier and the sustainability goals that the county government has for its operations. I'm going to break away from the PowerPoint for a moment and just show you the online survey that we have. The PowerPoint is really intended to make sure that you can go through this survey and understand the survey, all the components of the survey, and are able to fill out the survey. So give me a moment here as I flip over. This is what the online survey looks like. You can see in the chat the link that is also shown up here in the bar. It has several components, several questions, but it should not take more than 20 minutes probably to finish. Some of the questions are radio buttons that just tell you to rank high or somewhat or not important. And others are for you to identify different conditions that you've experienced and that have disrupted the services provided by county government to you. Also at the bottom of each slide, you'll often see that the link is provided so you can see it while we are going through the PowerPoint presentation. So the Story County Operations Climate Action Plan has a climate action plan scope and a public input. Excuse me, let me just one more say, let me reiterate what Amy had said before. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat or to raise your hand. Amy is watching closely to let me know when questions are submitted in either way. And then it's fine for us to stop during the presentation and address the questions while the presentation is ongoing. So the scope includes weather hazards, first of all, from the multi-jurisdiction, multi-hazard mitigation plan. This is a public process plan that has identified several hazards that cause disruptions, that cause damages within Story County and the jurisdictions within Story, multiple jurisdictions within Story County. And from that have come recommendations on how to deal with the impacts and how to keep services going and how to keep the public safe. That was one of our primary lists of weather hazards that we wanted to include in our climate action plan evaluation. We added a few others through discussion with the county staff early on and came up with a list of all the total weather conditions we wanted to analyze for the climate action plan. Outside of the operations and the reliability, the Grow Green team, as I said earlier, and Story County has sustainability goals, and that includes reducing the emissions from buildings, facilities, fleets, and the commute of employees to work. These are the most controllable of the emissions in the operational government, and that is why it has become the focus of the climate action plan evaluation. So for both of these, the hazard impacts and the emissions, the climate action plan will quantify how there are changes occurring in the impacts and how there are changes occurring in the emissions, and then make recommendations as how to address those changes. The public input is to gather from the public their concerns about, first of all, the weather that has occurred, and to document as much as possible from the public just when disruptions have occurred to the Story County government operations and to the services provided to the public. In addition to documenting when the public has not been able to use the services, we want to know if there are changes recommended through this process what the concerns are of the public for those changes. Are you concerned about the price? Are you concerned about the reliability of the service? Are you concerned about other matters? That is the thing that we want to know and put into the climate action plan to be able to inform the Board of Supervisors. So what I'll do is I'll go through the weather conditions that were identified for the climate action plan to address. I'll go on some discussion about what their impacts are, as best as we can tell so far, to the county government operations. And that is the lead-in for you to be able to provide any additional information that you have on impacts from weather on government operations and services to you. After I get through this part, we will go through some of the actions that are being considered for addressing the weather trends and their impacts. And then after that, we will get into the greenhouse gas impacts and how the greenhouse gases could be adjusted by actions. One last thing I just want to reiterate for the third time is if you have any questions about the weather information, please just put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll address them as we go through. And if you recall any weather events that you have experienced, then that can also go in the chat. At any time, you're welcome to go to the URL that has the survey and begin the survey. Here's where we have our weather events that we want to understand their impacts to the government operations and their trends. These include winter and summer weather, blizzard, winter storms, flash flood, river flood, wind, tornado, heat, humidity, drought, length of seasons, and air quality are the weather events that we are analyzing for their impacts on the government operations. These are also listed on the survey, as I showed earlier, and you can go to the survey at the bottom URL on this slide, or you can scan the QR code on the right-hand side as I'm looking at the screen to be able to go to that URL as well. So blizzard is primarily defined by a blizzard warning. It's issued by the National Weather Service. The conditions of a blizzard are that there are high wind with zero or limited visibility. There can be deep snow drifts. There can be rapid snowfall, but more often than not, it's more about the wind with the blizzard than it is the snowfall. And definitely dangerous wind chill, life-threatening wind chill, harmful wind chill. So to the county operations I have listed here as impacts, could be that there are highways that are closed. It could be that emergency response is hindered. Their time may be longer to respond to conditions, or they may not be able to get to a particular road if a car is stuck in a ditch, for example. There could be building services closed. For example, the administration building in Nevada or the human services building in Ames. And during the warnings, if staff are unable to get to work, then they would be unavailable to help and to continue to provide the services that they typically provide. In some instances, the blizzards can have 70, 80, 90 mile per hour winds, and that can cause wind damage primarily to buildings, but also to vegetation, trees around buildings. And in severe cases, I imagine it could cause some damage to the fleet if there are objects that were blown into the fleet cars and trucks. So those are the types of impacts. And if you have experienced any disruptions to county operations or county services because of a blizzard, we would like to know about them so we can report them and include them in our report to the county staff and supervisors. The trend in blizzard is not discernible. The wintertime continues to have about the same amount of blizzards. They are fairly infrequent, thankfully. And because they're fairly infrequent, it takes really quite a long time to be able to say whether a trend is present or not. And over the next 25 years, the status quo is what we expect to have. We've had some very cold years recently, it's true. And through the media, the term polar vortex has become popular. But for any reasonable statistical analysis, the frequency of polar vortex or the frequency of blizzard is not necessarily changing. And it will be quite a few years in the future till we can determine whether a trend has changed substantially. A winter storm is very much like a blizzard. We also learn about it because of a warning. Typically, it's a National Weather Service warning that talks about deep or rapid snowfall. Around here, there can also be ice, either ahead of the snowfall or instead of snowfall. And definitely, just like a blizzard, have dangerous cold and wind chill. So while these tend to be more snow producers than blizzards, then the wind may be a little bit less intense than what we typically see in blizzards around here. The impacts are kind of similar to the county government operations. There are roads closed often because of deep snow or the rate that snow is falling. We may be unable to have some of the staff at work because they are unable to commute through the snowy or icy roads. And again, because of the road conditions, emergency services may be hindered. They may not be able to attend to situations as fast as they normally would. Similar to blizzards, there's no real discernible trend, and there's no expected change in the next 25 years. This is another one of those events that takes a long time to really see the change, the statistical change in the frequency of these types of events. Flash flood, this is a flood that's primarily caused by rainfall, and it's distinct in our analysis from river flood. Flash flood can cause streams to swell, but is typically occurring right at the time of a rainfall or immediately after a rainfall. And you often see it in towns with lots of ponding and streets being covered with water, parking lots covered with water, and you see it outside of town with some low-lying areas having their roads covered and some streams being suddenly filled and, at capacity and running at high speed. Flash flood is something that is changing in Iowa by quite a bit and very quickly. When we know a flash flood occurs, it's not always everywhere that we know about it from a National Weather Service warning. The, rain areas where there are known impacts often get warned, but sometimes in rural areas, there are streams that people just know about. And there may be bridges over those streams that people just know about, that under certain rainstorms, they're going to have water over them. So in those cases, you may not receive a warning that's that specific and that local in a rural area, as warnings are typically issued over a polygon or, a multiple square mile area. So what are the impacts that we receive from the flash flood on our government operations? Well, it's a headache and a public hazard because of the roads and bridges that might be closed. This is where our roads team has to know ahead of time what bridges are susceptible to flooding and be aware from emergency folks that those bridges may need attendance to inspect for damage in the near future. And as well, the emergency officials need to know that the rain is coming so that they can be aware of those bridges or those roads being covered and block the public from getting into a dangerous situation. For the public and for the staff, there could be slow travel because they may need to take alternative routes to do the different types of work that they do out and about with all the different buildings and facilities. And the buildings themselves may be inaccessible during a flash flood because parking lots may be flooded or the streets where people go through to get into a parking lot and to get to a facility might be flooded or temporarily closed. In some instances, if the terrain is just right, there is a possibility for water to pool up against a building, and if not careful, perhaps leak in a little bit to the building. So the trend is pretty clear, and people have been talking about this for about 20 years now as one of the main impacts of a warming climate in the Midwest. They've been 100-year rainfall has increased by more than 10%. 100-year rainfall is meant to be a 1% chance every year that the rain will occur. It's kind of an engineering term that's applied to some stormwater management for design purposes. And so you also see it applied for bridge design purposes. So it's a really relevant tool for infrastructure impacts. In the left-hand side, you see two plots that talk about how the rainfall is predicted to be in the past, how the rainfall has been in the past 50 years and how it's predicted to be in the next 25 years. We have two types of rainfall. I mentioned the 100-year rainfall, that's in the lower left. That's the more extreme and the design-driven rainfall event. And then in the upper left is the 10-year rainfall. That's a 10% chance that it's going to occur as opposed to a 1%. So it's one that's more frequent. And you can see that in both cases, the orange bar is substantially higher than the blue bar, indicating that the heavy rain events are going to get more frequent, whether they're one every 10 years or one every 100 years. And these impacts associated with them will become more frequent as well. A river flood is similar to a rain flood, but it's not necessarily occurring at the time of the rain. Here is a flood in Cambridge back in 2008, and the river, especially in the Skunk River region, can have quite a delay between the time that the rain occurs and the time that the river goes over its banks. And it can also be related to sequential days of rainfall, as proven by the University of Iowa scientists when they performed the analysis of the 2008 floods. So in this case, a flood warning is almost always the way that we know about river floods, because the rivers are well known, they're well mapped. It has been the job of the National Weather Service and the Hydrological Unit to provide warnings and for flood conditions for public safety for a very long time. What happens under them is that roads can be covered, properties can be covered by water and inundated, contaminants can be in that water, or just the wash of the water can cause scouring to occur and damage to structures. So on the county government operations, what will happen is roads and bridges will be closed again as the water exceeds the banks and overtops the roads and the bridges. Similar to a rainfall flood, there could be slow travel and alternate routes that are required for county operations to do their work and therefore slow down or limit the amount of work they can do in a particular day. If there are buildings near streams, they are susceptible to damage. They can have an extreme flood, maybe one that hasn't been seen in the time before the building was built and not anticipated, to go over the banks and impinge upon a building, causing flood damage either through seepage into the building or scouring of some of the building materials. And then the outdoor staff itself needs to be aware, because as I said earlier, river flood doesn't necessarily happen at the time it's raining, and to keep an eye on those streams and rivers and the locations where the staff are working is an important part of their safety. So there is similarly a trend in river floods. In the lower left hand is a plot that was created for a study on the Skunk River. This is calculations for return intervals, meaning 1-year flood, 10-year flood, 100-year flood, 200-year flood. Just as I was saying earlier, that means it's a 1% if it's a 100-year flood. That means it's a 0.5% chance if it's a 200-year flood. That means it's a 10% chance if it's a 10-year flood. And what we found when we worked with the University of Iowa analyzing the stream flow projections for the bridge on I-35 at South Skunk River was that all of the return period floods were higher in the future period than in the historical period. And so at that point, that was a strong indicator that bridge design needed to consider future conditions as opposed to just historical conditions in order to ensure that design would last as long as it was intended to last. So similarly, we need to consider that our government operations need to be more aware and more prepared to be able to handle river floods going forward than they have in the past. Tornado and wind are lumped together. I'm not talking about the kind of wind that's a gusty Saturday afternoon. I'm talking about the type of events we've had recently, like derechos and other smaller storms that have caused winds of 90 to 120 miles per hour. The map up above shows the derecho from 2020 that did quite a bit of damage across central Iowa and in Story County in particular. So we know about tornado and wind from tornado and severe storm warnings issued by the National Weather Service And in general, what happens from these events are trees can be pulled down, power lines can be pulled down, and buildings can be damaged. Cars can be blown off roads and damaged. So these are high impact, but local, very local type of events. The impacts to our government operations are that if a building gets damaged, whether it's a roof or whether it's a side of a building, the building may need to be closed for a while in order to replace it. Or in the worst case with a tornado, if it's substantially damaged, it could be closed for several weeks. During the warnings, the staff are likely to be unavailable because hopefully they are going into a safe place while they are dealing with the severe weather coming to the area where they are. If the building, of course, is damaged, then the staff may be unavailable for a couple of days, and those services provided by the staffs may also be unavailable. And then a little bit more difficult to anticipate is electricity unavailability, because that depends upon different lines that may be blown down and the extent to which those lines can be reestablished, or an alternative source of energy can be brought in. So the primary impacts are to buildings or to the service interruptions of the buildings. There are also impacts to our parks, substantial impacts potentially to the trees and the availability of the park recreational services. We didn't list them here, but we recognize that those are damages that could substantially alter the public's availability of government services. So the trend in these is that the tornadoes are a very rare event, just like the blizzards that I talked about earlier. And so it's hard to really statistically say whether there's a trend or not. We know that there are some changes in the conditions for tornadoes that have become a little bit more frequent, but we can't say that that has resulted in a higher frequency of tornadoes or a higher frequency of tornado days. We don't expect necessarily that that will emerge as a trend going forward over the next 25 years. Basically, what we are dealing with tornadoes already is enough for us to deal with, and we should be happy that it's not increasing over the next 25 years. However, windstorms could increase, and that's because the humidity that drives the thunderstorms during the summertime is increasing. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in a few minutes. What happens is when there's higher humidity going into thunderstorms is it allows those thunderstorms to organize a little bit more, or to pull down middle atmosphere energy air. So the more intense the thunderstorm, the more capability there is, and the more humidity there is, the more intense the thunderstorm. So these trends are difficult to distinguish from the willingness of the public to report the damage. And what we can only say is that the conditions conducive to high wind thunderstorms has increased. We can't really say that the number of reports has increased solely due to those conditions. However, we expect those conditions to continue to increase, the number of days that we can have high wind thunderstorm days to increase going over the next 25 years. Here's my humidity slide. On the left-hand side is a plot of the summertime humidity. And this is actually a plot you can generate yourself if you want to go online to the link at the bottom. And you can generate similar other plots. The reason why I focus on the summertime is because that's when we get most of the humidity from the Gulf of Mexico into the Midwest. That is, of course, augmented by the humidity generated by the plants in the Midwest that are at their peak respiration during the summertime. So typically, we would see a summertime peak in humidity. But what we have seen recently is that that peak has gotten higher and higher and higher. And this plot up here that shows the average dew point during the summertime shows clearly that in 2010 and 2011 and later in the 2010s, we've had our peak years of humidity. It's not an accident. The trend is because, again, the Gulf of Mexico temperatures are higher. With higher temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, we have more humid air coming from the Gulf of Mexico, getting into the wind stream and coming up into the Midwest. That air sometimes falls as rainfall, of course. And when we get a lot of rainfall, there's a bit of a feedback mechanism where the soil gets totally saturated, holds the moisture that came in from the Gulf of Mexico, and then releases the moisture as the plants respire overnight and during the day. And so you almost get that humidity kind of twice. Once when it came up from the Gulf of Mexico in the wind stream, and once again when the plants pull it from the ground and put it back into the air. So those are the mechanisms that lead to this increasing trend in humidity. We don't really have a lot of humid warnings per se. We do have heat warnings, and heat warnings nowadays especially are tuned into what's called the heat index. We have extreme heat index days, and that's the combination of the temperature and the humidity. And more, the heat index days are being driven by the humidity than the temperature. Another early morning impact of high humidity is our dense fog, making it very difficult to see, especially when you're going around fields in the rural areas on county roads. So the impacts on the government is operations is both for individuals as well as for buildings. For individuals, there's a potential for a heat illness, and that's coming from the extreme heat index days. The longer you're exposed to the heat, the harder it is for your body to cool itself off, especially when the humidity is high. And so there's a real susceptibility to heat illness. You also need to generally run the HVAC cooling quite a bit harder than it typically does because of the high humidity. The cooling is less efficient. You have to generate and run, you have to consume more energy to run the cooling on these days. That causes higher utility bills, and even the comfort level that's provided by the less efficient cooling on that day is a little bit less comfort because internally you can't really get all the humidity out of the air, and it's not at the typical level of cool and dry air that people are accustomed. In the evenings, the reason why we have high utility bills is because we also need to use HVAC in the evenings for cooling. High humidity air has energy in it because of the water vapor absorbs the radiation and holds the daytime temperature, so to speak. So the surface temperature puts radiation into the air, and the water vapor holds that radiation overnight. That means your HVAC has to run harder overnight to keep your house cool, and again, running up utility bills. So there are times when everybody is running their electric cooling, and if it puts a tax on the system for putting electricity into the region, then there has to be a restriction on electricity. So these are the impacts that the operations receive: potentially heat illness for individuals, higher utility bills, and at times there will be restricted electricity use that they'll have to consider within their buildings operations, the people who are in the building, as well as the computing systems and IT that they need to keep functioning during a restricted electricity use time. So this has been a clear trend for many years and expects it to continue for the next 25. What you will see on this plot is something similar to humidity, the heat, the temperature. And as you can see is that the trend in temperature is not something that is going up. There are sometimes in spring and fall where temperature can be seen to be going up, but those are not the extreme temperature periods and the damaging to human beings temperature periods. During the summer and late spring, when we have our high temperature days, the frequency of those days are not necessarily clearly going up until you get to a very high temperature. So what that means is, how do we know about high temperature? Well, typically the Weather Service provides a heat warning or an extreme temperature warning. And this is something that's blanketed over the entire region. There's not such a thing as a very localized temperature warning. What you will see often, though, is that under a temperature warning or a high temperature day warning, that the urban areas are pointed out as becoming even higher temperature than the surrounding rural areas. The impacts that we have on our county government from the high temperature is a heat illness. We can also have vegetation death, such as trees and such as shrubs that are either protective of property or decorative of property. We have fish kill in some of our ponds and lakes if they get too warm. And then again, as with high humidity, we can have extended HVAC peak use, and that can cause higher utility costs. It can also cause HVAC systems to be under stress and perhaps not be able to function or to not last as long as people intended them to last when they were installed. As I said, unless you look at the very high temperatures, like above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, there really isn't a clear trend. You really have to get at the very extreme days, which have happened more frequently than in the past. But again, the problem with the very extreme days is that they are very infrequent, and you have to have a very long time period to be able to say statistically that the trend is real. So that is why I'm saying here that there's no recent trend. The trend is really in the humidity, not necessarily in the temperature. But we are expecting this trend to become more clear over the next 25 years. As we gather more data in the next 25 years, the anticipation is those hot days will continue to be as frequent as they have recently, and that'll be about the time period we need to really establish clearly that the temperature has changed, that extreme temperature days have changed. Drought is one of our conditions that impact our county government operations. We've been under severe drought recently. We've come out of it thanks to a great deal of rain this summer in July and August. We typically have a drought monitor that's talked about, but there aren't really necessarily drought warnings that come out from the Weather Service. So the way we know about it is that typically on the news or through the radio, people talk about the drought monitor that's provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or some people just know from looking at fields that they're dry. What happens is that the soil can shrink and crack, and the water levels can get very low, and this can have impacts on the county government because they may have a restricted water use in order to conserve the water. They may have some underground infrastructure shift as the ground shrinks and swells. And so they may need to keep monitoring if we've had continual long drought conditions or repetitive drought conditions, whether that has had impact on the subsurface of infrastructures. We also have vegetation stress. And again, if you have vegetation stress near a building, trees could be harmed. Trees could become dangerous because if they become diseased or harmed or stressed, and then a windstorm happens later on, they can blow over and cause building damage. So drought is not necessarily something that affects everything only on its own. It can have a compounding effect. So we don't see a recent trend in drought length or frequency in the next 25 years. What we are seeing for sure is that droughts are hotter. As I mentioned earlier, we are still trying to debug the frequency of very hot days in terms of whether there's the clear, unambiguous trend. But one thing that is clear is those hot days during the droughts are hotter than they were before. And then this is a little bit different than a high impact individual event. The length of seasons is something that is clearly changing. This is important for the maintenance around buildings. This is important for allergies and for air quality concerns. In this nice plot that was provided by Climate Central, we see that the what are called planting zones, the plant hardiness zones, which are produced by the USDA, have changed substantially. You can see the average temperature of the plant hardiness given at the bottom of the squares of the rectangles. Plants needed to be hardy to a temperature down to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit in the past from 1951 to 1980. Going forward into the future, the next 25 years, they will need to be hardy only down to minus 3.7 Fahrenheit, according to that plot and to the analysis from the USDA. So what that means is growing season lengths will get longer. That means there's an impact on our properties that the county government owns and operates and manages for invasive vegetation and invasive insects. That means the timing of ice and snow and soil thaw will become quite different. Instead of being in maybe February or March, or excuse me, instead of maybe being in April or March, as in the past, it might be February and March. It may also end up with a change in the frequency of soil thaw. And so these things are important to keep in mind as we have new buildings being built and they're exposed to a different soil thaw frequency. And we should also have regular evaluation of the current conditions to see if they've reacted to any of the soil thaw changing. One of the odd things that happens is rain on snow. It's something that in the past hasn't been talked about too much. In the past, we've talked about ice jams in the springtime, but as we get a shorter season, the ice period for a river or for a lake is shorter, and the ice jams become less of a problem. However, we can get a late spring snowstorm into March, into April, even May, and then you get the situation where you have a thunderstorm raining on top of a snow pile, and that's a much bigger runoff of rainfall than what the thunderstorm would be providing on its own. It can result in a flood hazard. This can also have a big effect on road maintenance, and that's probably where the effect is going to be the most costly, is understanding if there are more thaw cycles because of a shorter season, then having a later into the spring freeze causing a temporary thaw, a temporary freeze followed by a thaw. Then the road maintenance, the timing of it, then the amount of it that needs to be done when the winter road condition is finalized and kind of shifted over and graded into a spring road condition makes a big difference whether or not you are prepared for a late ice storm or a late snowstorm. So the trend is a shorter winter season. We've seen that for sure. And we have seen a shift to higher plant hardiness zones as well. And both of those trends are going to continue over the next 25 years. And finally, air quality. Air quality relates to the length of seasons. As I said earlier, it also relates in the spring and summertime to smoke from forest fires or grassland fires. So there are air quality warnings issued by the National Weather Service. That's how we know when an air quality event has occurred. Typically what can happen, oh, excuse me, this slide needs to be updated. The impacts of air quality are not that roads covered with water a few inches or that streams rise suddenly. The impacts of air quality of a warning issued by the National Weather Service is difficulty breathing, poor visibility, discomfort with your eyes as well. So these are health effects, and these are potentially hazard effects from low visibility. The impacts on our county government is that people who have respiratory ailments and who work outside will be more exposed to those respiratory conditions and may experience those ailments more often. You need to be careful when you're an outside person traveling around from facility to facility that there may be poor daytime visibility. Usually you worry about daytime visibility at the morning or in the evening, but you may need to worry about it midday. And that just may not be something that people have thought that they needed to worry about before. And because we have filters in all of our HVAC equipment, more smoke days, more high pollen days causes those equipment to become clogged quicker, and you need to be on top of replacing it in order to maintain the internal air quality at our buildings. So we've seen these air quality things occurring more frequently recently, and we're going to continue to see that trend going forward in the next 25 years. Well, those are our weather events, their impacts on our county government actions, and the trend that we expect over the next 25 years. And so what we're going to go through next are potential actions that Story County government can take in order to reduce the impacts and to be prepared so that the government operations can remain resilient, can remain functional, and that we are cognizant of the cost impacts from these weather events and to be able to reduce the cost impacts. What I have on these slides and what is available in the online survey is a list of actions listed on this slide from the lowest cost to the highest cost. The cost of these actions are rough dollars. The lowest cost is like less than $100,000. The highest cost is more than $1 million. And it's a little bit difficult to sort them out because some of the costs are operational costs and some of the costs are capital costs. So this is a rough indicator of the cost, not a specific budget planning cost indicator. And what we want you to do is to indicate, given the cost of these and what they are attempting to improve upon, to provide resilience, to provide functionality, your willingness or your level of support or your level of priority for taking these actions. We have actions that are building specific, including to improve the flood proofing of doors. That's in the instance of floodwaters impinging upon a door, and we're wanting to prevent it from seeping in. We have actions listed here that are aligned more with moving and developing roads and bridges to be able to withstand a deeper flood or a stronger flood, and to be able to recover the operation of that road or of that bridge more frequently. And those are the more expensive options. I'm going to read through them real quick. And if anyone has any questions, for sure, just put a question in the chat and we'll clarify. Again, we started with the cheap options: improve flood proofing of doors and openings at Story County government buildings. A little bit more expensive, we can reduce the ponding so it doesn't get up to the doors and flooding at the Story County government buildings. This is through either stormwater drainage or some other water storage improvements like a rain garden. Away from our buildings where we have roads, we could develop some open space or wetlands so that the water can get pushed into a more horizontal distance instead of a more vertical distance. And then similarly, we can raise the level of bridges rather than moving the landscape around the bridge. We can actually raise the bridge or the road, and that's the most expensive option. I put in here also increase emergency response staff. If there are roads, if there are bridges that are frequently flooded, and we just need people to be able to respond to potential emergencies more quickly because those floods are happening more frequently. One way to do that is to have more response staff. For wind and tornado, again, the tornadoes we don't expect to increase much, and we have good plans in place already. But winds of high wind speed in summertime, summer thunderstorms could increase. At least the conditions that support them are increasing. Again, ordered from lowest to most expensive, we have that we could increase the number of tornado safe rooms in our Story County government buildings to keep our staff safe from the wind events, especially. We could remove trees adjacent to the buildings so that there's less potential to damage buildings when these windstorms come through. We can upgrade the Story County government buildings to withstand a higher wind load and potentially stronger tornadoes, but that is a more costly option than the previous two. And similarly, as I said before, if we're worried about the number of summertime thunderstorms, we can increase the number of emergency response staff. And in whatever ways that's imaginable, either permanent staff or temporary staff during short periods of the summer when these events get more often. Our resilience for winter storms and blizzards are a couple of options. There are not as many for this one. If we want to maintain our services available, but we are not able to have people travel the roads to get to work, one way to make sure services continue is to provide staff with an ability to work from home and a technology, and to be able to provide the services online, at least to the people who can interact through an online medium, to make sure those services are continuous, even though those people are not able to travel to the office. That's typically a lower cost option, but also maybe not quite 100% effective. We can increase the number of snowplows. That's kind of expensive because snowplows are expensive, but also because you may only need to use a large number of snowplows once every 2 or 3 years. When we talked about high temperature and humidity, this has a lot of personal effects for heat illnesses in particular. So the way we can deal with providing people comfort and a way to cool their bodies is, well, one is to increase the tree canopies around the Story County facilities and their properties. And that way people can go and take a break, sit under a tree, drink some water and begin to cool off. You can also have strategically located facilities that are designated as cooling centers, places where there are fans or where there's some access to some ice so people can cool off quickly, meaning people who work outside for the government. Enable technology for services that are working from home during extreme temperature days. This one is a little bit, I think, unusual. It's been done in a few places, but the idea is, just as in the winter, if it's too dangerous to go to work because the roads are in bad condition, perhaps an extreme day of temperature or high humidity, high heat index is also a day where people should not be going to work and instead should be working from home. One to consider and discuss. In order to reduce the amount of electricity that's needed to keep the building cool, you can use high reflecting surfaces on the ground around the building or on the roofs. There's also coatings that can be put on windows to begin to prevent as much radiation coming in from the sun on those really hot days. There are the possibility to continue to increase the energy efficiency of buildings, and that way your energy is not so concentrated use during a high heat day, and there's less likelihood that you'll have either electricity problem at your building or that you could contribute to the need for a brownout or reduced electricity in the region. And then finally, if you're very concerned and you don't really have options, you can always have electricity generation on site. And that can be through a generator, or that can be through other measures such as a solar array, which would work just fine on a very hot sunny day. And now this is the last part of my presentation. We're going to transfer our talk out of the weather events and the impacts they have on the county government operations and services, and talk about the impacts that the county government operations have on the environment. In this particular case, it's the greenhouse gas emissions, and their impact on the environment is to continue to put an accumulation of greenhouse gas in the air, and it is the global accumulation of greenhouse gas that is leading to an upward trend in the global temperature. And more importantly, for the Midwest, one of the important trends is the the Gulf of Mexico increase in water temperature. As I said earlier, that's one of the main reasons why there has been a change in humidity in the Midwest. And so it is a goal of the sustainability team to be cognizant of the impact that the increasing greenhouse gases have, not only on the global temperature, but also even on the things that are really close to us, the Gulf of Mexico, and have a direct impact on us, and to be considered good citizens by reducing those impacts. So the way this is done is, first of all, Leanne had said earlier that they had greenhouse gas inventories made for 2010 and 2020, and they asked us to review those inventories. The inventories evaluated the actions of the operations and the energy used by the operations. And the energy used is for building and facilities, heating and cooling primarily. The actions involve people moving around in vehicles, whether they are employees or whether they are coming Story County staff moving from place to place. And then we also have water and wastewater. That's a part of, that's kind of an action. We use water, we use wastewater, and it's a result of human activity. So what the greenhouse gas inventory shows us is in the upper left in the pie chart, and it shows that we have about 40% of the emissions from our building and facilities energy uses, and about 45% from the Story County vehicles themselves, and about 14% from the employee commute. And so those are our main areas to consider how to reduce emissions: the buildings, the Story County vehicles, and the employee vehicles. In the lower left, you can see a future prediction. This is considered a business as usual future, where we consider that the Story County government doesn't take additional steps to reduce its emissions. And what happens is, even without taking any additional steps, emissions are expected to go down. And there are two primary reasons. From 2020 up through 2030, the emissions go down primarily from increases in renewable energy used by the City of Ames and Alliant Energy. This is largely wind energy that has been installed, and to a lesser extent, solar energy that's been installed. From 2030 onward, there remains some goals of Alliant Energy and the City of Ames to be reducing, to rely more on renewable energy and reduce their carbon footprint. But it's a little bit less clear which of those goals will be met. So the reduction from the energy change is not as substantial in the second half from 2040 to 2050 as it is in the first part from 2020 to 2030. As we go out from 2025 to 2035, we also anticipate that cars will continue to have a higher gas mileage than they had in 2020. And because of that gas mileage being improved, less gasoline and less diesel will be used. And because of that, the emissions from both the fleet and the employee commute will go down. So to summarize again, the greenhouse gas emissions are a sustainability goal of the Story County government. They would like to reduce their contribution to the global greenhouse gas levels. The operational sources primarily come from the fleet and the buildings. And we can already expect a 10% reduction by 2030 just because of the efforts by Alliant Energy and the City of Ames, and 15% by 2040. So here are some actions that can be taken above and beyond to increase the greenhouse gas reductions going forward. One is that we can replace the county government vehicles fueled with gas with E85 vehicles instead. We can also do a similar thing with the diesel vehicles by retrofitting to have 100% biodiesel. And both of these would not bring you down to a zero emission by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a substantial reduction compared to gasoline and diesel in the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted in its production and in its emission at the tailpipe. We can also have, during the Story County government vehicle replacement cycle, to replace the gas vehicles with hybrid vehicles. And we can also replace our gas vehicles with electric vehicles. So as before, we order this from lowest cost to highest cost. Typically E85 vehicles or conversion of biodiesel vehicles are pretty much at the same cost as a gasoline vehicle or a diesel hard heavy duty vehicle. Right now, hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles are priced higher than gas vehicles, and that's why we have a higher dollar sign there, a higher cost. That may not be true in the future if the price of batteries continues to go down as technology improves. But at the moment, it is seen as a higher cost. For our buildings and facilities, there are a few ways we can do this. Part of this involves how many people are being at work to have to run utilities for, and part of it has actually constructing some new things around buildings. So going from the top of the list, least expensive, to the bottom of the list, most expensive, one possibility would be to implement a 1 day per week work from home policy. And that way parts of the buildings would not have to use electricity at the level that they use when the building is fully populated. We can also do a similar thing that would close off an entire building department on high heat days. And that way we reduce the electricity demand that that building has, as well as electricity use and cost on high heat days. The Story County government could purchase electricity from community solar farms, for example, the one in the City of Ames, or they could also purchase electricity from wind farms that are being developed outside and have a direct power purchase agreement. Those are moderately more expensive than the policy changes I mentioned earlier in people coming to work or staying at home. The one thing that you guys should really be proud of is that there's a great deal of geothermal installed in our county government. There's still opportunity to look to install more efficient HVAC systems. This costs a little bit more, but I think the history with what they already have with geothermal speaks well to how much it pays itself off. And it helps a lot with the sustainability goal and reducing greenhouse gases as well. You can build on-site electricity generation with solar panels. You can either be on land adjacent to the buildings, they could be on some roofs on the facilities, or they can be as canopies in the parking lot. Typically, this is more expensive because typically you have to own, but there are people who have devised ways to make this almost like a lease or a power purchase agreement, and that can be substantially less expensive than the typical ownership model. And finally, Story County could spend a little bit more money in its operations and purchase renewable natural gas to displace the fossil fuel natural gas that they currently consume. But far and away, the electricity emissions is where the biggest bang for the buck is for reducing greenhouse gas. How do we handle our fleets and our cars? One way is to have fewer days that you're commuting to work. Again, we mentioned earlier that 1 day per week work from home policy would help with building electricity. It could also help with reducing the commute emissions. Similarly, when they have non-essential building departments on high heat days that are closed, then those people are working from home and also are not commuting and burning that gasoline or diesel. And something that could be adopted from other places is to provide an incentive for the Story County government employee carpooling. There are places that provide a couple $100 for 3 months for people to ride together, to do a van pool or to do a carpool. And that could be a consideration here as well to limit the number of cars that are being commuted in. Finally, we really didn't talk too much about this because we really want to reduce emissions, not offset emissions, but there is consideration to be able to, there is space to be able to consider offsets in addition to the reductions. One would be to plant more trees. We have quite a bit of space next to buildings where trees could be planted. We have quite a bit of parks where expanding the forested area could be counted as an offset. We could also invest in landscape projects that store carbon in the soil and in the vegetation in the surrounding rural community. There are entities that sell environmental credits, and these credits can have multiple impacts that are positive. They can have water quality impacts, they can have recreational impacts, and they can also have carbon storage impacts. And so that would be one area to look for offsets. And that brings me through all of the items we wanted the public to know about and all of them that we would like them to provide input on. And once again, the standard way to provide the input is through our online survey. You can get to it by the QR code in the lower left or along the lowest part of this screen, the SurveyMonkey link. Either one will take you to that site. For the remainder of this time that we have this evening, you can also continue to put the questions that you have or comments that you have into the chat, and we'll be able to record them as part of the climate action plan. So that leads me to the end of this presentation that I have, and I'm going to turn the floor back over to Leanne for any closing comments. And Amy, if there are any other comments that I need to address from the public, to make me aware of those.
Hey, Chris, no comments yet. Sorry. Go ahead,
It's okay.
Yep.
I just want to thank you, Chris, for the presentation again, and thank everyone for attending or watching the recording too. I know we really value your input and look forward to hearing what you have to say, and the comments you provide will forward on to the Board of Supervisors.